Okay. For the second years in Alupe University, the biology group, this is our unit, Systematics and Taxonomy. This is an introductory lecture, and in this we'll be looking at various aspects. For example, we'll be looking at living things, what they are, their characteristics, what makes them different, then why it is important for them to be different, and lastly, we'll look at how we can go about classifying these organisms that we will have introduced ourselves to. To begin, therefore, I'll give you an introduction just from a very basic point where we'll be looking at what is biology, the importance of biology, the branches of biology. So biology is the scientific study of life and living organisms. As most of you must be knowing, biology comes from two Greek words. One is bios, which means life, and the other one is logos, which means study. So directly put, therefore, you can say biology is literally the study of life. Okay? You can talk of biology as being the study of life. So it's therefore through biology that we it's through biology that we can get to have answers to certain questions. For example, what makes living things different from non-living things? Another question we can obtain answers through biology is how do our bodies work? Another important question, which is vital to our life, is how do plants make food? Okay. Another important question concerning the environment is why is it that some animals can survive better? Some organisms can survive better in certain environments compared to others. Then finally, another important question, for example, is how do diseases spread? And once we understand how these diseases spread, then we should be in a position to come up with ways of controlling these diseases. So in a way, through biology, we can obtain answers to all these questions that I've highlighted. We've seen the importance of, we've seen the definition of biology. We've seen the types of questions that we can answer through biology. So the next bit will be then, is biology important? Okay. Why is it that people take time to study biology? So it is true that biology is very, very vital in many areas of life. Some of these areas include, for example, in medicine and health. Through biology, we can understand how our bodies function. So once you know how our bodies function, then we can be in a position to also understand how diseases will affect our bodies. So people who work in the health sector, those are doctors, nurses, clinicians, they use their knowledge in biology to diagnose and also treat illnesses. We have vaccines, we have antibiotics, all this, their discovery was made possible through biological research. In Kenya, an example we can give, there has been a lot of research on malaria. Through this research, important developments came about. One of it is in the prevention, where now mosquito nets are used, and these mosquito nets they get to be treated with insecticides. These insecticides that are put on the mosquito nets can either kill the mosquitoes when they touch or they repel them. So through this, thousands of lives have been saved. The other importance of biology is in agriculture. So in order for farmers to understand crops and animals, the crops that they are growing, the animals that they are keeping, that knowledge, farmers get it from a biological perspective. Once they have that knowledge, they can now use it to improve the crop yields, the animal breeds, and also prevent disease or control if at all the disease has already happened. So such knowledge will eventually help to improve farming. Another important aspect of biology is we can use it in ecology. So in ecology, biology is key because it explains how living things interact not only with each other, but also with the environment. So once you understand how living things in a particular ecosystem interact with each other, then you are in a position now to know how you can help those living things to survive more, because you understand how they interact with each other, you understand how they interact with their immediate environment. Through that appreciation, you can also come up with ways of conserving forests, because most of these animals will rely on those forests. You can come up with ways of conserving water. We need water. Water is life. Okay? Biology also teaches us about climate change and how that change in the climate affects diversity. Okay? Through biology, new inventions and technology are made possible. Through biology, we have things like vaccines, things like antibiotics, very other important inventions, especially in biotechnology. Okay, there's something we call cloning. So all these inventions end up having a positive impact on human life or life in general. Okay? So that is about the importance of biology. But what about the branches? So biology is a broad subject and it is divided into various branches. The whole importance of dividing it into various branches is to make studying it easier. So some of the key branches include, for example, botany, which involves the study of plants. Another one is zoology, which involves the study of animals. Another branch is microbiology. In microbiology, you study some very tiny organisms. These are organisms that you cannot mostly see with your naked eye. Okay? Another branch of biology is ecology. Ecology, you are looking at living things interacting with each other and how they interact with their immediate environment. Another vital branch of biology is genetics. Genetics is the study of inheritance and variation. Okay? We'll look at more into these branches later on. Another important branch of biology is physiology. In physiology, you are studying the functions of the various body organs, how the body functions. Okay? So these are the various subdivisions of biology. So when you are studying biology, you end up studying most, if not all, of these branches. Okay. We've seen that biology is the study of life. We've seen the branches of biology. For you to study life, it means you are looking at living things because it is the life of those living things. Either you are looking at the life of a plant, the life of an animal, the life of a microorganism. So in a way then, when you are looking at these living things, they should have some special characteristics, some special features, which make them to be different from the non-living things. So those features that separate living things from non-living things are called the life processes. Without these life processes, you cannot have life continuing. So the characteristics of living things are what defines this living thing, so that whenever a particular organism practices that, then it is likely to be a living thing. One of those characteristics is nutrition. Okay, so nutrition is the process by which living things obtain and use food. It has to obtain food. Then once it has obtained that food, it uses it, it eats it. Then that food will be used for growth, for repair, and for the provision of energy. So food provides nutrients. With the nutrients you have carbohydrates, which is vital for energy. You have proteins, which are key or important for growth and repair. Then you have another set of nutrients, which is vitamins or minerals. The vitamins or minerals are critical in the maintenance of good health. So the types of nutrition, you can either have a living organism obtaining food through an autotrophic mode of nutrition, which is also called self-feeding. This is mainly practiced by living organisms that have the ability to make their own food. Plants, for example, do so through photosynthesis, where they use sunlight, they use carbon dioxide and water to create energy. Another mode of nutrition is heterotrophic nutrition. In this type or mode of nutrition, the living organisms that practice it feed on others. So it means they don't have the ability to make their own food. So they need to either depend on plants or other animals. Okay, so types of nutrition is either autotrophic nutrition, self-feeding, or heterotrophic nutrition, where an organism feeds on another organism. So the second characteristic of living thing is respiration. So respiration refers to the process by which living things release energy from the food they will have obtained through nutrition. So once they obtain food, they have to break down that food, then release energy contained in that food. So the process by which these living things release that energy is what we are calling respiration. The energy released through respiration is important not only for movement, growth, reproduction, and even other life processes. Just like nutrition, respiration also happens to be in two main types. One is aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration needs the presence of oxygen. Okay? Needs or requires the presence of oxygen. Then you have the other type of respiration that we call anaerobic, which is the type of respiration that happens without oxygen. Okay? That happens without oxygen. The application of this, there are people who make traditional brew, ile wanaita busa. They use yeast. So yeast respires anaerobically. to produce alcohol. Okay? Yeast respires anaerobically to produce alcohol. The other characteristic of a living thing is movement. And in this case, movement refers to the ability of living things to change position or place by themselves. Sio kwamba upepo ikuje, ivume, isongeshe, hapana. It has to be the ability of that living thing to change a position, to move from one place to another by itself. So in animals, movement is obvious because you move all the time. Unaamka asubuhi, unatoka kwa room, unaenda kama unaenda kununua kitu kwa duka, that is movement. In plants, on the other hand, the movement is slower and less visible. But still, movement also happens in plants. The type of movement we are talking about in plants can be things like when the plant is bending, either towards light, is bending towards water, or is closing leaves in response to a particular stimuli. Okay? This whole concept of movement finds huge application in the wild beast migration, where animals are now moving from Serengeti in Tanzania to the Masai Mara in Kenya. Okay, so that movement, the animals are moving in search for food and water, pasture and water. But it has become one of the greatest occurrences in the world. So people come to watch, and as a result, there is generation of revenue. Another important characteristic of living things is irritability. Irritability refers to the ability of living things to detect and respond to changes in the environment. Those changes is what we now refer to as the stimulus. So irritability is just a response to the stimuli. If there is a lot of heat, if there is a lot of light, if something touches you, if it is hot, you move. Okay? So it means you are irritable. If you place your hand on a hot sufuria, utatoa hiyo mkono. Usiku ukiwasha light, when a cockroach was somewhere, it will run. Okay? There is this plant we call the touch me not. Ukiishika, it closes its leaves. Okay? So the leaves will close. All these are responses to a stimulus, the change in the environment. Okay? Another characteristic is growth and development. So growth refers to the permanent increase in size and mass of an organism. With growth, there is an increase in size. There is an increase in mass, uzito. That is growth. But development just refers to the change in complexity. So an organism becomes more advanced in structure and function. Through development, an organism becomes more advanced, not only in its structure, but also in the function. So if you are talking about a fertilized egg, it can grow into a chick. That is growth. But then the chick, ile kifaranga, it will begin to grow feathers, it will begin to grow wings, and eventually have the ability to fly. So that is development. Okay? So non-living things cannot grow, non-living things cannot undergo development. Another characteristic is excretion. Excretion is the removal of waste products that are made inside the body. Okay? So most of these excretory products will include things like carbon dioxide, urea, and even sweat. So the process in which all these excretory products are removed from the body is what we are referring to as excretion. Then There is another important characteristic of living things which we are referring to as reproduction. So through reproduction, there is the production, there is the producing of new organisms, what people call easily as offspring. So that production of new offsprings is a characteristic of living things. Reproduction can occur in two ways. One is asexual, where only one parent is involved. Unataka kupanda miwa ama ndizi, unaenda unachukua hiyo miwa yenyewe, unaenda unapanda. Okay? So you are getting a cutting, napier grass. Unachukua hiyo, the stem, the stalk, unaenda unapanda. Mtu amepanda mandizi, akikata moja, unamwambia nisaidie. The stalk ya hiyo ndizi unaenda unapanda. That is asexual reproduction because the offspring is genetically identical to the parent. Wale watu wanapanda viazi, unaenda unachukua the potato cuttings, unaenda unaweka chini. The same thing to sugarcane, same thing to napier grass. Okay? So in that case, you are just taking one parent na unakata, unaenda unapanda chini. Okay? The other type of reproduction is sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, there is an involvement of two parents of the opposite gender, so the male and female. Okay, so in this case, the offsprings will show variation because the offspring will have inherited genes from both parents. Okay, will have inherited genes from both parents. The other characteristic of a living thing is death. Okay, so death is the permanent end of all life processes in an organism. So any living thing will have a life cycle. It will be born, it will grow, it will reproduce, but eventually it will die. Okay? So death is the permanent end when all the life processes within an organism ends, then we say that organism has died or has undergone death. Okay. So those are the characteristics of living things. But as you might have noticed, living things are fairly different, which means there is a lot of diversity among the living things. This diversity can vary either in terms of shape, in terms of size, in terms of structure, and even in ways through which these organisms live. The diversity or the difference is largely as a result of those living organisms adapting to the different environments that they are living in. Such environments could be if an organism is living in a desert, another one is living in a forest, another one is living in an ocean, ingine ipatikane kwa mountain. Then, for the parasites, when you find some organisms living inside other organisms. So, the differences will be as a result of the adaptation of that particular organism to where it is living. Ile utapata kwa desert itakuwa tofauti na ile unapata kwa forest. Ile unapata kwa maji kwa mfano itakuwa tofauti na ile inapatikana juu ya mlima. Because those environments are different. Then the living organisms that are found there will also be different because they are responding to their immediate environment. So it is on the basis of these differences that then we need to classify living organisms because we must find a way of creating order. Okay? So on the basis of the differences, sababu kuna these living organisms zenye ziko tofauti sana, lakini tunahitaji at least tukue na njia ya kuziorganize. So that way in which we organize these living organisms is what we are calling classification. Okay? So classification, which other people refer to as taxonomy, is the process by which scientists group living things. What they use to group these living things is either the similarities they have or the differences that they have. The importance of this classification is to organize the vast number of species on Earth. After we've organized them, then it is now easier for anyone to study them. Think of classification kama kupanga nyumba. Ukienda kwa room yako, possibly kuna nguo umeweka mahali fulani, kuna your cooking utensils umeweka mahali fulani, kuna viatu umeweka mahali fulani. How you end up organizing your house is possibly on the basis of function. Huwezi pata kwa mfano umechukua kijiko umeweka ndani ya kiatu, because they do different duties. But you can find a spoon umeweka ndani ya kikombe. Then unaweza pata socks umeweka ndani ya kiatu. Alafu upate blanketi umeweka juu ya kitanda. You are now organizing your house on the basis of function. Unaweza pata kitabu kwa mfano umeweka juu ya meza. Lakini fikiria uingie kwa nyumba ya mtu kwa room, upate amechukua mattress ama blanketi iko juu ya meza. Okay? Amechukua kiti ameweka juu ya kitanda. Okay? So through classification we create order on Earth. Once that order has been created, then it is now easier for anyone to study the living organisms. So, as it is, we have about a five kingdom system of most living things. One, we have the Monera, which includes those single-celled organisms. These are single-celled organisms that have no true nucleus. So in the Monera, for example, in the kingdom Monera, you find mostly what we call the prokaryotes. You find bacteria hapo ndani. The other kingdom is the Protista. The kingdom Protista mostly includes the single-celled organisms, but they have a true nucleus. Monera also have single-celled, but not true nucleus. Protista, yes, they are single-celled, but they have a true nucleus. So in a way then, the Protista become single-celled eukaryotes. The other one is the fungi, which is mostly multicellular. So the fungus is made up of organisms that are mostly multicellular, except of course yeast. Another characteristic of the fungi is that they do not photosynthesize. So they need to absorb nutrients, mostly from decaying matter. Okay. The other kingdom is the kingdom Plantae. Kingdom Plantae is made up of multicellular organisms, but have the ability to make their own food through photosynthesis. Then their cells have cell walls, and those cell walls are made up of cellulose. Then the last kingdom is kingdom Animalia, which is multicellular, made up of multicellular organisms, and those cells don't have a cell wall. And members of this kingdom Animalia are heterotrophic, kumaanisha they depend on other organisms for food. Okay. Through taxonomy, through classification, we have those five kingdoms. The importance of classification is to create order. So that whenever you want to study, for example, you can choose, I want to study members of the kingdom Animalia, members of the kingdom Monera, members of the kingdom Protista. Okay. But these living organisms, they are made up of some level of organization. Okay? So it means that when you are looking at a living organism, you are looking at the life of that organism. But the life of that organism is highly organized. It is fairly stratified. And therefore, for you to understand the life of that living organism, you must also understand how that life is organized into various levels. So these levels have different complexities, from the simplest microscopic cell to the entire biosphere. Okay? So we'll begin with the simplest, which is the cell. The cell is the basic unit of life. So the real definition of a cell is the smallest unit of life that is able to carry out all life processes. The life processes are the characteristics of living things. Okay? So all living things are made up of either one, if you are talking of a unicellular organism, or more cells, if you are talking of a multicellular organism. Above a cell, you have various cells that are grouped together, that are sort of similar and end up performing the same function. We call that a tissue. So higher than a cell, you find a tissue, which is a group of similar cells performing the same function. You can talk of the muscle tissue within animals. It helps in movement. The xylem tissue in plants, which is key in the transportation of water from roots to leaves. Okay? Beyond the tissues, you have an organ. An organ is made up of tissues that are different. And these different tissues will be working together to perform a specific function. Okay? Examples of organs in animals is something like the heart. The heart pumps blood. Another organ, for example, is a kidney, which filters waste. All these are made up of different tissues, but those tissues are working together to enable that organ to perform a specific function. Higher above an organ is an organ system. And an organ system is a collection of organs which are working together to perform major body functions. In this case, think of the digestive system, which is made up of the mouth, for example, the stomach, the intestines. The major function that the digestive system is doing here is breaking down food. Think of another system, for example, the circulatory system. The circulatory system is composed of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood or the fluid in those vessels. The importance or the main function of the circulatory system is the transportation of materials around the body. Then now higher than the organ system is the organism itself. So an organism is a single, complete living thing that can survive independently. A complete living thing, single, complete, having the ability to survive independently. Think of a human being as an organism, a cow, a lion, a maize plant, a bean plant, a eucalyptus tree. Those are organisms. So these organisms, if they are of the same species, and they are living in one place. You have organisms of the same species living in one place. Then we call them a population. Okay, we call them a population. Then when you have different populations that are interacting in the same area, then they form a community. Different populations, meaning organisms from different species, but they are interacting in the same area, then we can call them a community. Now, when you take that community and you look at the immediate environment of that community, the physical environment, soil, water, air, climate, then together with the community, you are now looking at an ecosystem. So an ecosystem includes a community of organisms and their physical environment. Okay. Then now higher than the ecosystem is the biosphere, which includes all life on Earth. So in a way, the biosphere is the highest level of organization, and it includes all ecosystems on Earth and all the forms of life, be it air, water, and land. How all those forms of life interact. So all the ecosystems, an ecosystem is an environment with a community. Okay. So the biosphere is the entire ecosystems on Earth and all those forms of life that are interacting therein. We've seen that living things are diverse, or living things are different. And maybe the question is, what makes them different? What causes diversity among living things? So diversity is just the differences that are found among living things. These differences do not happen just by chance. These differences are created and shaped by biological processes and environmental conditions. So there are biological processes and environmental conditions that will create these differences. Among the main causes of diversity in living organisms include 1. Genetic variation. Genes are what we inherit from our parents. Okay? Genes are the functional units, that are the ones that will eventually code for proteins. Then proteins will now be responsible for all the processes through enzymes. There could be small differences in these genes amongst individuals. So for example, amongst us, kuna mwenye ni mweupe, mwingine ni mweusi, mwingine ni mrefu. When you look at the genes, for example, that code for those, you will realize kwamba kuna utofauti. So because of those differences, the differences in the genes, those genes are the instructions that will be determining those traits. So the instruction for height, kama instruction ya huyu na huyu mwingine ni tofauti, mmoja atakuwa mrefu, mwingine akuwe mfupi. The genes that code for skin color, if the instructions for one are different from the instructions for another, then the skin color will be different. The genes that are responsible for the ability of either someone to be easily susceptible to a disease or resist that disease, if the genes are different, then the resistance that huyo mtu ako nayo kwa hiyo ugonjwa pia itakuwa tofauti. Because each of us, apart from identical twins, because each of us, hata wewe na ndugu yako, wewe na dada yako, we inherit different sets of genes from our parents, then we don't necessarily have to look exactly alike. So sisi tutakuwa tofauti from one person to another. There will be that difference, there will be that diversity, one, because of genetic variation. The other thing is a mutation. A mutation is a change in the gene. Okay? If there is a change along the way, a sudden change along the way of within the DNA of an organism, it was not there before, but there is a change that has come in, then that is a mutation. And that mutation, that change, will create a different set of instruction. Okay, so if the previous gene was responsible for being short, if there is a change, if there is a mutation, and the new set now brings forth not a short person, but a tall person, it will have brought in a what? A change. Some of these mutations can be helpful, some of them can be harmful, but there are others which will not have any effect at all. Okay, we'll look at that next semester when we are looking at genetics. The other cause of differences is sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction is where two parents combine their genes so that they form an offspring who doesn't look like any of them. If you remember in high school, kuna kitu ilikuwa inaitwa crossing over. Okay? So through crossing over, which happens in fertilization, okay, that process is now what leads to the genetic mixing. So that the offspring, you are a mix of the genes you got from your dad and the genes you got from your mother. So as an offspring, you end up with a mix. And that mixing is what increases the differences, or what we are calling diversity within a species. Okay. Another cause of diversity is adaptation to the environment. We said different organisms live in different environments. If an organism is living in a desert, another one is living in a forest, another one is living in water, another one is living on a mountain, you don't expect these organisms to look the same, because there is a way in which each of them has been forced to adapt or to change so that it can survive in its environment. So those different environments are the ones that will lead to the different changes, which we are now calling adaptations. And those different adaptations, those different changes, are what will now eventually result in an increased diversity. Okay? Another cause is evolution. Evolution is descent with modification. Okay, descent with modification. So it means, for example, human beings, monkeys, gorillas, we come from a common ancestor. We have a common descent. But with the time, there has been a gradual change. So we are undergoing modification. As human beings, we are being modified. As gorillas, they are being modified. As monkeys, they are being modified. It is that modification over many, many, many years that will eventually lead to the development of new species. Once a new species has been created, then it is different from what was initially present. So with that, evolution will have resulted in the development of differences. Okay? Another thing is the geographical factors or isolation. When you have groups of the same species being separated from one another, either with a barrier like a mountain or a river, then if you have a group in one place, then there is a mountain, the group on this side of the mountain will not be able to meet and mate with the group on the other side of the mountain. So over time, each group will sort of adapt to its environment. Because remember, from one part of the mountain to the other, There could be even different foods. There could be different stimuli, different temperatures. Okay? So with the time, the group on one type of the mountain, because it is isolated from the other group, they cannot meet. They become more used to what is present in their environment. As they get more used, they then become adapted to that particular environment. Because of that adoption, utapata kwamba, the adaptation, utapata kwamba, zitakuwa na utofauti hata kwa tabia. Okay? You might realize maybe on one part of the mountain, it is colder. On the other part, it is hotter. So the ones in the colder part will adapt to the coldness na zitakuwa na tabia fulani. The ones on the hot environment will adapt to the hotness na zitakuwa na tabia yenye iko tofauti na hizi zingine. So this bit of isolation is what has led to the differences. So this isolation has led to diversity. Okay? That isolation is what has led to diversity. We've seen the causes, but what is the importance of studying the diversity that is present in living things? So when you are studying diversity that is present in living things, you are not just interested in the naming those organisms, but through studying the differences, you end up to understand life itself. You end up to have better ways in which you can solve problems, not only that are being experienced by humans, plants, or any other organism, but also you have the ability to conserve the environment. Okay? So, by studying the diversity, the differences among living things, we end up understanding the evolutionary relationships. When you look at what is different between one organism and another, it sort of helps you to understand how connected each of those organisms is. Okay? And possibly, not only how just connected they are, but how they have been changing with the time. You can compare physical features, you can compare behavior, you can also look at DNA. Then through that, you can trace the relationship between living organisms. It is important to understand the evolutionary relationships because it helps us to understand the origin of species. Okay? It helps us to explain why some species are more similar than others. Because we've understood the evolutionary relationship, we can explain why, for example, we are more similar to chimpanzees and monkeys than we are to, for example, a lion. Okay? The other importance of studying diversity of living things deals with the conservation of biodiversity. To conserve means to protect, means to manage the natural resources, which includes plants, animals, and the ecosystems. So when you are protecting, when you are managing those resources, you are doing so that those resources cannot disappear. Why is it important that we don't want them to disappear? One, we want to prevent the extinction of species. Two, we want to maintain balance within the ecosystem. Then you remember when we were talking of balance in the ecosystems, in the fundamentals of ecology. Then three, we want to support tourism. You want to maintain wildlife so that people can come, waangalie the wild animals, visit the parks, so that we can have a what? Source of revenue. The third importance is medicine. Most of the medicines that we use are either derived from plants, animals, or microorganisms. So when we understand these organisms from which we can derive medicines from, then we increase our ability to discover new drugs. And by discovering new drugs, then we are able to enhance our fight against diseases. Okay. The other importance is in agriculture and food security. When we understand the differences among the various crops, we are in a position to improve those crops, to improve the livestock by designing breeding systems. When we've improved the crops, we've improved the breeds within the livestock, then we are in a way a better position to ensure that we have enough or even more than enough food production, even in harsh conditions. By understanding the different types of maize that we have, understanding the different types of varieties of animals, you can design breeding programs to ensure that you have crops that are drought resistant, pest resistant, and even disease resistant. So with that, you'll have enhanced food production. Then the final importance is on the sustainable use of natural resources. We are not just talking of using of natural resources, but we are interested in using those natural resources in a sustainable way. So the word sustainable means using resources in a way that meets the human needs of today without destroying them for the future generations. So sustainable use of natural resources means unatumia leo ili kuweza kutosheleza mahitaji yako, lakini you have to ensure that hata wale watu ambao wataishi kesho na kesho kutwa pia waweze kupata mahitaji yao kutokana na ile mali ya asili. Okay? So the sustainable use of natural resources is important because through it we can prevent overexploitation. Overexploitation in this case could be overfishing, for example, deforestation, for example, poaching. Okay? When we use it sustainably, we prevent overfishing, we prevent deforestation, we prevent poaching. You just get enough of what you want. With the sustainable use of natural resources, we can also end up protecting the environment. With protecting the environment, it means we are ensuring that we have clean water, we have clean air, we have fertile soils. So with that then, the ecosystem is able to support all the other forms of life. We've seen the definition of biology. We've seen the importance of biology. We've seen the characteristics of living things. We've looked at why it is important to characterize those living things. We've seen what causes the differences. So can we now begin to zero into taxonomy as a concept in biology? Okay. So taxonomy itself is a branch of biology, and it deals with the naming, describing, identifying, and classifying living organisms into organized groups. You name, you describe, you identify, then you classify. After you've classified, you bring order, you organize those organisms into various groups. Okay? These groups can be from very broad ones, like kingdoms or even phyla, to very specific bits, like the species level. So, when you are talking of taxonomy, think of it like a filing system in biology, a library catalog, okay? And what that does, it helps us to track the millions of living things on Earth. If you go to the library, because there is a way in which the books are arranged, utafika hapo kwa pali penye kwa shelf, ukienda, you go to a particular place. But imagine if the books in the library were not arranged, ungekuwa unapata hiyo kitabu namna gani? Ukiingia kwa nyumba yako na unataka kuvaa viatu ama unataka sweater, you must have organized in such a way that unajua tu nikiingia hivi sweater itapatikana mahali fulani. But think of it, if there was no organization, hakuna mahali penye umegroup hizo nguo. Ukitaka kitabu unajua nitaangalia juu ya meza ama nitaangalia ndani ya bag, because there is a way in which you have organized whatever you have in your house. Ukitaka viatu unajua ziko pahali fulani. Ukitaka sufuria unajua iko mahali fulani. But if all of those things were not organized, okay? If all of those things were not organized, there will be no order. Ingekuwa hata wewe ukitaka kutumia kitu fulani kupata inakuwa ngumu. So taxonomy is about creating order. You create order by coming up with organized. You don't just come up with groups, but those groups are organized. You organize those groups on the basis of some features. Those features are given after you have described and identified. That's when you ascribe a feature. So in biology then, why is taxonomy valuable? Taxonomy is valuable because it helps in organizing life. Without taxonomy, studying life will be chaotic because we have different organisms, millions and millions of organisms. If all these were not organized, were not categorized, were not grouped, ingekuwa ngumu sana kusema we can study them. So taxonomy arranges these organisms in an orderly way. Taxonomy brings order out of a chaotic world so that then scientists can find these organisms in an easy way. And once they've found them, they can compare them, they can study them. Okay? So the example we give, that instead of just saying cat, taxonomy uses the scientific name Felis catus. If you just said cat, it will be difficult to identify, is it a domestic cat, is it a wild cat? Okay? So you have to be specific, because when you say now Felis catus, is different from the wild cat, is different from the jungle cat. What has brought that order? What has brought those differences is because of taxonomy. Hiyo ndio imeweza kuorganize kwamba hii itaitwa hivi, hii itaitwa hivi, na hii itaitwa hivi. But kama tungesema tu paka, you don't know if it's a wild cat, if it's a domestic cat, but you've just said paka. Okay? Another importance of taxonomy is it helps in universal communication. So common names will vary by language and culture, but scientific names are the same worldwide. So that helps to prevent confusion among scientists across the globe. Maize, for example, is an English term. In French, they call it differently. In Kiswahili, we call it differently. So, yet globally, taxonomy has given it, then refers to it as Z-maize. So it doesn't matter where you are in French, where you are in Kenya, or whether you are in America. So long as you talk of Z-maize, then The scientist in America, the scientist in French will understand. The scientist in Kenya or even Tanzania ataelewa kwamba unaongelea juu ya kitu fulani. If we didn't have taxonomy, then these people will not have a common way in which they can communicate without confusion. Through taxonomy, we can understand evolutionary relationships. The way you organize things in your house, you organize them mostly on the basis of function. Utapata kwa kitanda umeweka shuka, umeweka blanketi, sababu zinatumika kwa kulala. Utapata labda kwa viatu umeweka rangi, umeweka socks, umeweka brush, sababu zinatumika hivyo. Utapata ndani ya bag umeweka kitabu, umeweka kalamu, because that is how they work. Utapata kwa sufuria umeweka mwiko, umeweka kijiko, umeweka kikombe, karibu na hizo, because that is their function. So you are not just grouping these things, but you are basing on something. Okay? So the same thing taxonomy does is it does not just give names, but it shows how those organisms that it is naming are related through evolution. So organisms that are closely related are placed in the same group, either in the same family, in the same order, or in the same genus. You place them because they are closely related. So it means through taxonomy, you have organisms that are closely related being grouped together. So when you understand that, then it helps you to understand how related these organisms are from an evolutionary perspective. Also, taxonomy is the basis for other biological sciences. If you do taxonomy in an accurate way, then you make it to be very critical, very essential, very vital in medicine, in agriculture, in ecology, and even in conservation. If you misidentify an organism, it can easily lead to a wrong treatment. If you went to the lab, mtu achukue sample yako, akiangalia kwa microscope, aseme uko na something that is causing diarrhea, lakini ya aseme whatever ameona kwa microscope is not what is causing diarrhea. Whoever will now be looking at the results atakupatia a wrong treatment. If someone is identifying a pest differently, the treatment ile itapeanwa kwa hiyo wanyama ama hiyo plants ama hiyo crops itakuwa tofauti. Okay? If you are looking at a particular organism, we talk of the white rhino. If you looked at a rhino and said this is not white rhino, italeta shida upande wa conservation, because you have given taxonomy but wrongly. You have grouped an organism but in the wrong way. Okay? So if you identify a disease-causing microorganism accurately, then the treatment will be correct. If they identify a particular variety of crops, agriculture will benefit. If they identify a particular organism that is on the verge of extinction, then conservation efforts will be brought in. But if all the identification is done wrongly, then all the other sciences that are relying on taxonomy will suffer. Okay? The other bit is conservation and biodiversity management. In order to protect life on Earth, we first need to know what species exist. How we identify the species that exist is largely taxonomy. Okay? So through taxonomy then, you are able to identify which species is endangered and which species is not. So once you've identified a particular species that is endangered, then you can go on and now initiate conservation of that particular endangered species. Because if you've identified a species that is endangered wrongly, then you begin to conserve a wrong species. Yenye iko endangered, itazidi tu kuendelea kukua endangered because you are conserving a wrong species, mainly because you identified it wrongly. Okay? So in summary, taxonomy is like the language and filing system of biology. It's through taxonomy that you assign, that you identify. Then after you've identified, you can now group. Okay? After you've identified, then on the basis of that identification, you can now put these organisms that you've identified into various groups on the basis of their relationships. But how has this taxonomy developed historically? Okay? So currently, taxonomy seems to be very advanced as of today, but that has not been the case ever since. Taxonomy has developed gradually through different stages. We had very simple groupings during the ancient times, but currently on the strength of DNA and other molecular tools, we've developed very complex modern systems. So in the early days, humans classified plants and animals in very basic and practical ways. Plants were grouped as either useful, those ones that were used for food, medicine, or even building. Then others were just grouped as harmful, the poisonous ones, the weeds, those ones that could not be eaten. Animals were just grouped as domestic and wild. The domestic ones ni zile zinaweza fugwa. Then the wild animals were those that were dangerous or those that were hunted for either meat or skin. Along the way, there was a Greek philosopher who was a student of Aristotle. He is known as the father of botany. His efforts are what led to the grouping of plants into either trees, shrubs, or herbs. This grouping was done mainly on how these plants looked like and their ability to grow big. So if they were trees, any plant that would grow tall was categorized as a tree. It could grow tall and it had a woody trunk. Those that were categorized as shrubs, these were smaller woody plants. Then there are those who could be categorized as herbs because they had soft stems as plants. So as you see, this was a very simple way in which categorization was done. However, it is recorded as the very first attempt to classify organisms in a scientific context. Later on, there was some scientific study that ended up having a very slow situation. Mostly because knowledge at this time, between the 5th and the 15th century, was influenced largely by religion, culture, and superstition. So classifications during this time were made based more on what people believe rather than any careful observation. Remember, religion, culture, and superstition is largely on the basis of the belief system. Okay? So therefore, during this period, not much was added into the real scientific taxonomy. Okay? So not much happened during this period that was ruled or influenced mainly by religion, culture, and superstition. Fast forward, we've had quite an explosion, okay? We had an attempt to define and use the word species. This attempt was made by John Ray between 1627 and 1705. It was him who explained that a species is actually a real group of organisms which can naturally reproduce amongst themselves. The only thing he did, which was later challenged by Darwin, was that his emphasis that species are fixed and they don't change. But now we'll see Darwin brought about evolution, which leads to the change of species. Between 1707 and 1778, we now had the Swedish naturalist, Linnaeus himself. He is known as the father of modern taxonomy. Amongst his greatest contribution was the binomial nomenclature system, which we will see later. Through the binomial nomenclature system, organisms are assigned two Latin names: the genus and the species. Okay? The examples: humans, we are Homo sapiens. Maize or corn is Z maize. Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species. Okay? So the work of Linnaeus is what provided the universal system that is even still used in biology today. From the 19th century onwards, we had very interesting developments. One was by Charles Darwin, who proposed the theory of evolution using natural selection. It was Charles Darwin as well who showed that indeed a species can change over time, and most of these species will be having common ancestors. Okay? So that meant then that taxonomy should not only group organisms by appearance, but also by evolutionary relationships. So not just that a bird, yani ndege, inaweza it can fly. Also an insect can fly. Can that make you put them, group them in one taxonomic group just because both of them can fly? Okay. So those are some of the questions that became important at that particular place. Interestingly, now in the 20th century, we have new scientific methods that have made taxonomy to even be more advanced. We have the phylogenetic taxonomy, which classifies organisms based on phylogeny. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history. Phylogenetic taxonomy shows which species are more closely related through the use of phylogenetic trees, otherwise called evolutionary trees or cladograms. We also have molecular taxonomy, which uses now DNA, RNA, and proteins to compare organisms. Through this, classification has been made to be more accurate. Sasa hapa hauangalii tu appearance. You don't just look at what a particular organism has, but you compare beyond. You go to the molecules, you go to the DNA, you go to RNA, you go to protein, and compare at that level. Okay? So, through phylogenetic taxonomy, through molecular taxonomy, we've been able to refine taxonomy. So we not only now classify on the basis of function and appearance, but we classify, one, on the basis of evolutionary relationships, and two, on the basis of the molecules, the biological molecules, DNA, RNA, and proteins. The example we give here is that through DNA studies, whales are more closely related to hippos than to fish. Lakini ukiangalia a whale na uangalie samaki, Just by appearance, you might think whales and fish are more closely related, but that's not the point. Okay? So in essence, in the modern era, the Darwin's theory of evolution, phylogenetic trees, and DNA studies, they've really, really revolutionized how we look at taxonomy. So that is a broad introduction to this concept of taxonomy, this concept of life, and the concept of the differences that are present among living organisms. In the next lecture, we'll now begin to get deeper into various concepts of taxonomy and systematics. Listen to this video, take your notes, and in case you have a question, you can reach out to me. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Asante.